Hello and welcome to a Bible class online, and I appreciate if you're seeing this. In this class, I'd like to discuss the authority of Jesus. The word authority is a strong word. And when we hear the word authority, there's a certain force, perhaps even intimidation about the word. We talk about the authorities, and we rightfully have a sense of respect, maybe a sense, and to some degree, a sense of fear. The word authority also denotes permission and perhaps privilege. Authority also carries with it the idea that someone is able to determine things, to decide things, to render judgments. Jesus had all the authority above. In fact, Jesus had all authority. And that's where I'd like to go with part of this lesson, Jesus' claim to authority. Now we read in Matthew 28:18 and 20 that it says, "And Jesus came to them and said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth is given to me.'" And there's some observations about this statement that are quite remarkable. He's making the claim, as he did similarly in other places throughout Scripture. In fact, John 17 comes to mind. In which he's talking to God, and he's glorifying God and talking about how God had given him those from the world. And the idea there of giving them was that God was placing Jesus over them in authority. Jesus was responsible for them. They were given to Jesus to help spread the gospel. But there's a lot of observations, I think, or several observations about Matthew 28:18 through 20 that I think are worthy to look at. First of all, Jesus is claiming the authority. It has been given to him, he stated. He doesn't just take it on the authority, but he tells the apostles to do something with it. He doesn't just say, okay, I've got authority, but now he gives it to them by extension. He transfers the authority for others to act under him. Whether it was the apostles, disciples of the day, it certainly included us as well, by extension. And that's a key point. Also in Matthew 7 and 28, we read something similar to this. "And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teachings, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, and not as their scribes." He was the source of the information. He was the source of the teachings. Several times throughout the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus was concluding there in Matthew 7, he says, "You've heard it said," and then he would say, "But I say." So he's going to the source. He is the source. And of course he's referring in so many times to the common knowledge or accepted practices that the people had, and certainly the practices that the people were taught to obey. That's why he said, "You have heard it said," from their religious teachers, from the scribes and others. But he's saying, "I say." So he was taking them back to God's pure word, which, by the way, as John tells us, in the beginning was the Word. In other words, Jesus was there. And so he has that authority as well. In the overall context of these verses, the Matthew 28 and Matthew 7, there are similarities between here. First of all, Jesus is expressing his authority. He's not just acknowledging, he's expressing it. And others recognize his authority, as we said in Matthew 7. And certainly by the actions of the apostles, they came to recognize Jesus' authority. Jesus' authority was never unquestioned. There was times when people would question his authority, even today. But in these cases, his authority was not questioned. He tells his listeners to put it into practice. I think I made a misstatement there. I said Jesus' authority was unquestioned, meaning what I meant to say is Jesus' authority was questioned on times, but he proved who he was by his miracles and by the depth and knowledge of his teachings. But in the case of the apostles, they did not question Jesus' authority. And so tells them, puts it into practice. John chapter 5, verses 25 through 27, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming, and now is here, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man." Again, there's some things we can pick out of this verse that relate to the authority of Jesus. I kind of keyed, first of all, in on the statement where he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and is now here, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God." And then he says, "And those who hear will live." Hearing there doesn't mean we're just hearing the sounds come in our ears. It means we're assigning meaning to it, and we're listening to it. And that implies then that we put it into effect. We take action on it. And that's why it says those who hear will live. Hear in this case implies obey. But as we read in there, the source of the authority that Jesus has is God the Father. And those that hear will not die. Matthew 7, verse 24 says about someone who hears Jesus' words but not put it into practice. Jesus calls them a foolish person, building their house on sand, and the waves wash it away. And so, again, there is that sense. Jesus has the authority from God, and you're foolish if you don't put it into effect. But also there's a time element involved. It's not some vague future that will put it into effect. Jesus is implying now. Change your life now. Put it into effect now. Not like some kid in school who asks the question, "Will I ever use this?" Jesus is saying, put it into effect now. And so as we live as disciples, we live, we teach. Every command Jesus taught, we teach. Not our authority, not our commands, the Lord's commands, the Lord's authority. And so Jesus extends his authority to his disciples on two specific occasions. And I really love this passage, or these passages. On two specific occasions, Jesus granted to the apostles extreme authority, extending even into heaven. Now, these are specific to the apostles of the day. We do not have that authority, but he gave it to those apostles. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 19, Jesus says, "I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And we know what this is about in context. Peter had just made that marvelous statement about who Jesus was. Jesus had asked the question, "Who do men say I am?" And the apostles there, the disciples, they related various prophets or John the Baptist, whatever. And Jesus says, "Well, who do you say I am?" And Peter steps in there and said, "You're the Christ." And then Jesus tells him that's been revealed to him by God. And so then he's addressing all of the disciples here. He says, Peter, but not exclusively Peter, about loosing and binding on earth and in heaven. So he's giving them the authority. He's extending his authority to them. And the other occasion when he said this was in Matthew chapter 18, verse 18-20. He says pretty much the same thing, but there's a little bit difference there. He's added to it. Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again I say to you, if two of you agree on earth about everything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered in my name, there am I among them." This is such a misunderstood passage, this thing about two or more gathered in his name. A lot of people want to talk about that in the context of we're coming together in Bible class. That's not what it's saying. The expression is meaning, if you, again, remember, he's talking to the apostles here. If you agree with each other, I'm there with you. I agree with you also by gathering in his name. That means we We're coming together under his authority. And so the expression, in my name, is another one sometimes. That literally means by his authority. In other words, they were speaking by the authority of Jesus. Really, this is the same as when we pray today. We typically will say in Jesus' name or some other similar expression. We're saying by his authority, or as Jesus would, or as Jesus wills. And so we're extending that authority, but not our authority, but Jesus through us. There's another dimension of authority that is not often studied, and that is the ability to grant privilege. In John chapter 1, verse 12, it says, "But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God." And so one cannot grant what one is not authorized to grant. And it certainly is a privilege to be a child of God. A wonderful privilege. The greatest privilege we could ever hope for. And so Jesus is extending that privilege to us. And so he has the authority to extend that privilege. All right, so that's a lot of good information. Let's talk about what it means. So what's the application of it? What can I take away from it? Eventually, the expression of Jesus' power resulted in a conflict between him and the Jewish authorities. Jesus was questioned so many times. In Matthew 21, though, we find something that's an interesting statement. Jesus is in that final week of his life, and he goes to the temple and he cleanses the temple. He drives out the money changers and goes through all of that. In verse 23, it's the next day after he's done it, the chief priests and elders of the people, they challenge Jesus. They say, by what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you that authority? So they're questioning Jesus. See, the Jewish leaders were the gatekeepers to the religious teachings, and that's why they're asking him that question. If you wanted to be a teacher in the temple, if you wanted to teach people in different situations, religious especially, then they had to approve you as a teacher and what you taught. So that by extension then, they're saying, we didn't give you this authority, so what gives you that authority? No one was allowed to teach unless they granted them their approval. Now that's a kind of a counterfeit authority, because God did not give them that authority. And here they are, in essence, limiting the authority of God. Of course, they didn't recognize Jesus as who he was. So Jesus was challenged to their authority, but it was not a realistic, it was a counterfeit authority. And so Jesus wouldn't even answer their question. He challenged them back with another question, and when they couldn't answer his question, then he refused to answer theirs. Jesus then tells two powerful parables about how those of the religious world were rejecting Jesus and his teachings, and they were doing so to their peril. And there in verses 45 and 46, it says, when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking about them. And although they were seeking to arrest him, they feared the crowds, because they held him, being Jesus, to be a prophet. And the point is this: if we reject the authority of Jesus, we don't do what he says, we're rejecting him. And it goes full circle to really the Sermon on the Mount, when he tells us to put into practice his teachings. It also goes full circle to the Great Commission to obey all that he has taught them, and to teach others to obey it. And you know, Romans 1:16, Paul talks about not being ashamed of the gospel. Also in Matthew 10:32, whoever fails to acknowledge him before men, he will, or rather, whoever does acknowledge him before men, he will acknowledge before God. And acknowledge means we know who he is, what he did, what he does, and we recognize and acknowledge his authority. So in conclusion, Jesus teaches us to believe on him, to obey him, and to live for him, and in doing so, to grant that same opportunity to others. And so he has extended to us through the Great Commission and other teachings, and through the teachings of the apostles, he has extended his authority for us to teach on his behalf. And my friends, not just his authority for us to do so, but also the responsibility to do so. And so we recognize Jesus and we obey the Master. Thank you for listening to this, and always remember, we serve the Master. We're the servant. It is his authority that we extend to others. Thank you.